Good morning and happy Wednesday. I hope that your day is off to a good start. Obviously, I'm in my real indoor office at First UMC here in Hamlet. Good second cup of coffee, and this time it's a USS North Carolina mug. The battleship down in Wilmington. It's a great way to spend a couple hours if you like old ships, and I do. I did decide to pre-record this one. Next, as you are watching this, I'll be at the beach at my happy place out in the Outer Banks. I may do something from out there. I don't know yet, but I did decide to pre-record this. As I've been doing the last several weeks, I'll be looking today at another religious group that is, I guess we could call it heterodox. Groups that that don't fit with small O Orthodox Christianity. I guess 3 weeks ago we looked at the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then after that, the Church of Christ Science, the Christian Scientists. Then we looked at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons. And today, a group that is very different from those first three, the Unitarian Universalists. This is a very, very different group than the others. In terms of size, it is much smaller than the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons. The Mormons just dwarf it. The Mormons have about 6.8 million members in the U.S. Unitarian Universalists are about 215,000. Jehovah's Witnesses are about 1.2 million. So both of those are much larger. I don't have a good stat for the Christian Scientists. I would imagine, if I had to guess, that it would be probably roughly the same size as the Unitarian Universalists, but not nearly as big a size disparity as with the other two groups. Like I said, this group is much different. The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, both in very different ways, see themselves as being restorationists. They see themselves as being the true church and as being an effort to restore what had been authentic primitive Christianity. And the Unitarian Universalists are not that at all. So to begin with, before we get to what they believe and practice, we need to look at the name, Unitarian Universalists. This religious organization, this body, came from the formation of two fairly distinct religious groups in 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists. And I'm going to be just referring to those two bodies as they existed in the U.S. There's also branches of them in Europe as well. But here in the U.S., the Unitarians, they grew out of Puritan Congregationalism up in New England. They were sort of an offshoot of that, and in particular, they were a reaction against the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening really took off in the 1730s, 1740s, and Unitarianism was in part a reaction against that. Unitarianism was in part a reaction against the emotionalism of the First Great Awakening. The Unitarians also um, flourished in part because of the Enlightenment. A Unitarian view of God, fit in very well with the deism, which was very popular among the Enlightenment thinkers. So, what is a Unitarian? As the name implies, it believes in the oneness of God. It does not believe in a Trinity. So, it doesn't believe that, say, Jesus is divine in any sense of the word. Jesus may be a great teacher, a moral example for us to follow, but he's not divine. And they certainly would not believe in the Holy Spirit as an active living presence. So Unitarian, meaning they focus on the oneness of God. They would deny the threeness of the Trinity. They would deny the Trinity. Hence the term Unitarian. Amongst our founding fathers, a number of them would have called themselves Unitarians. John Adams certainly considered himself a Unitarian. Jefferson was a deist through and through. I'm not certain whether he considered himself a Unitarian or not. He may have, but I wouldn't swear to it. When we get into the 1800s, the Unitarian movement became closely associated with some of the major transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, etc. The Unitarians tended to be well-educated upper classes of society, and this as a movement, as a religious movement, continued into the 20th century. But as the 20th century grew on, I think that the movement probably lost some steam. It had earlier on been very influential, but as you get later and later in the 20th century, it loses its prominence. Now, the Universalism. The Universalism, its origins are quite different. Universalism grew as sort of a radical offshoot of Pietism in the 1700s. Okay, so just to define a term, Pietists or Pietism refers to any sort of religious movement or religious group that focuses on piety and how we live out our faith. So you could rightly consider the Moravians of the 1700s, the Wesley brothers, to be pietists, where the focus is on the heart and on how we live out our faith, on the practices of the faith. It's not to the exclusion of deep theology and Bible study, but there is more of an emphasis on the practicality of how we live our faith. What are the practices of our faith? Matters of the heart. And so Universalism grew or emerged as sort of a radical offshoot of Pietism in the 1700s. It was a reaction against rigid predestination that was really prominent, a real feature of traditional Puritanism and Calvinism. So from this radical offshoot of Pietism, you have a movement that denies the reality of hell and holds that ultimately everybody will be reconciled to God. So universalism, as the name would imply, is universal salvation. It is the belief that there's not actually a hell of any sort, that, and further, that ultimately every human being will be reconciled to God. Um, some universalists, um, there's a wide range amongst them. Some universalists, in terms of the rest of their belief system, are pretty much in line with traditional Christianity. Others went further afield. Went further afield to deny original sin, to believe that Jesus is not one with God the Father, and at that point you're really wandering off the reservation in terms of traditional small O Orthodox Christianity. So what happened in the mid 1900s, 1961 in particular, these two groups merged to create the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Unitarian Universalists. That body, as it exists right now, is you'd be hard pressed to really call it a religious group. Some of their meetings are called churches, Unitarian Universalist Church. Other times, other branches will call themselves Unitarian Universalist Fellowships. Um, in because what has happened with this body, they have drifted so far. I guess to use a crude term, drifted so far left um, that they have sort of jettisoned all doctrinal beliefs. In fact, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship up in Black Mountain, North Carolina, on the sign out in front of the building says "Love Beyond Belief," and I think that probably sums it up. They have largely jettisoned any doctrinal belief standard, any doctrinal belief system, and their focus is purely on loving each other, which is certainly a good thing. They have 7 basic principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships, acceptance of one another, free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and democratic principles both in their organization and in society at large, a goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice, and respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. So this is what they focus on how society lives in justice and harmony. The Unitarian Universalists are very liberal politically, and I guess I would hate to call them liberal theologically, because it's hard to say they have a theological system, because they have largely jettisoned any doctrinal standards. It is normally considered a religion, but in a way they have sort of moved away from religion into the realm of purely fellowship. Some members do believe in a personal God. Some Unitarian Universalists would believe in a universal life force, universal mystery. Others would call themselves agnostic or even atheist. You do not have to hold to any sort of belief in God at all. Whether small g God, big G God, God's plural, you don't have to hold any sort of belief system at all. to be a Unitarian Universalist. It is all about living up to and living into those 7 principles. That's why I think that the sign in front of the UU Fellowship in the Black Mountain is very illustrative. Love beyond belief. It doesn't matter what you believe. You can believe in God. You can not believe in God. What matters is that we're going to love each other and we're going to live into those 7 principles. Like I said, the Unitarian Universalists are very different from the first 3 groups that I've mentioned. Those being the Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, and the Mormons. This group is totally different. They are, if they are a religion at all, they are not a particularly religious religion. It is very much a matter of the head and how we live out just love, brotherhood, justice amongst everyone in society. So that is the Unitarian Universalists, and I hope that I have described them fairly. I've tried to describe them fairly. But anyway, if you're riding down the road and see a Unitarian Universalist fellowship, that's who they are. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.